Good morning. This is Adult Bible Fellowship class with Mike Matthews in Cincinnati and my class. We're covering a series on Colossians. I think this is lesson 5, and we'll be exploring again the centerpiece of the whole book, which is verses 15 to 20 of chapter 1, called the Hymn to Christ. And it's the richest passage in the Bible, in the New Testament, about the nature of Christ and who he is. We're spending half of our 13 weeks on, but we only have, looks like 2 weeks. This is the second week. And I would like anybody listening, all of you in the class, again, we don't have a chalkboard. I haven't figured that out. So if you get a pen and paper, pretend it's a chalkboard as well as notes to yourself. And when I refer to some things with an outline, it'd be good for you to have it in front of your face so you can see what I'm referring to in front of you all the time. So if you want to grab a piece of paper and a pen, it would help you. First, a review from last week. We looked at the hymn, and we've discovered that there are 2 stanzas, 2 main parts. And we looked at the first part being about Christ's work as creator and the Lord of creation. And then the second part in the middle of verse 18 is Christ is the Lord of the church, of his people, who will become the rulers of a new creation. And while we were discussing that, we said that there were 3 specific phrases in the hymn that have created a lot of discussion and controversy, and even some cults have used, like Mormonism. And we needed to look at them more closely, more importantly, so we understand them, because this is the most important passage in all the New Testament to combat heresy, because it gives a correct version of Christ, who he is, and what he did in the gospel. And interestingly, the cults use some of these verses to teach their heresy, and we need to not only know where they're wrong, but what the real point Paul is making there. And those critical statements, if you open your Bible, just so you can be reminded, and we'll get to it in about 5 or 10 minutes. So verse 15, the beginning of the hymn, is 2 of them. And it says, who, the beginning of the first stanza, refers to Christ, who is the image of the invisible God. So what it means for Christ to be an image is controversial. Number 2 is the firstborn of every creature. So firstborn, and Mormons believe that Christ is created like we are, and we can be created and create gods. And verse 20, where it says at the end of the hymn, the last verse, where it says what Jesus did, and having made peace through the blood of his cross, by him to reconcile all things unto himself. So there's a view that Christ is not the same as God. He's subordinate to God, and that he has saved everyone, universalism. So there's a whole group of Christians that have been active in Europe and Western civilization and in America since our founding, like John Adams was a Unitarian, and most of them believe in universalism, which means everybody can be saved. All right, so there are the 3 words, main words, or several words related to them, but we're going to be looking at image and firstborn, and then reconcile and all things, those together, but they're those individual words. But to interpret words, that was part of our last series we did on how to study the Bible effectively, and we weren't able to complete the series, and the next lesson I had before the virus shut down that series was going to be on how to study words effectively. And so here we're going to use a chance of what we would have given some more generalities about the importance and the difficulty of correctly interpreting words. And does anybody remember, I'm going to unmute all, in our last series,
wait just a minute till it loads in.
You're all unmuted. Let's see, let me mute the one
You
person.
said you're on now, so.
No, you're on it.
No, where he's trying to get Nick and Judith on.
Gotcha.
He's on the phone.
Okay. So my question is, do you remember what the most important single fact, there's one word for it, what you must do to interpret the Bible correctly, any passage, any book, or any verse, or any word? What's that one single most important word of our whole series last time? Starts with a C. Blank is king. What is it?
Context.
Who said that, Tom? Context. Okay, good. I'm going to mute you all again. All right. So context is king. So before we look at those three words today, let's remember our context from last week, and review never hurts. So we are in chapter 1 of the book of Colossians. No matter what word or passage you're looking at, if you're ever talking to anyone about their beliefs, even if you're just discussing other beliefs and they may not be a Mormon, they say, well, Mormons say this, so it may come up even if you're not talking to a Mormon. In fact, it probably will if you talk about your beliefs often. You put me on here. So you have to stop in your own mind and stop them if necessarily directly. It's like, okay, every word, no word has meaning by itself. They only gain their meaning in context. So let's stop and look at the context. First of all, there's a New Testament book. It's the Apostle Paul in an epistle. It's one of the clearest places where it doesn't take a lot of work to interpret, because he's very specifically dealing with doctrines and church issues in our contemporary language. It's not in the Old Testament, so that's good. And in this book to the Colossians, he writes it with a purpose. So you have to realize, where is Colossae? And it was in Asia Minor. It was a church he had not been to. Epaphras had come to visit Paul. He was in prison. And Epaphras had learned about the gospel from Paul in Asia Minor in Ephesus, and traveled east to Colossae and apparently founded the church. And he was concerned with some beliefs that were cropping up, and he came to Paul to share his concerns. And Paul is responding in the first letter to those concerns, and writes the letter to address those concerns. And the first chapter, so now you narrow down the context of the hymn. What's the context for the hymn? The context is, first he opens by thanking God for the church. He's at work in them, and so that's verses 1 through 8. And in that one long introduction and then one long sentence, he thanks what God is doing in that church, their love, their faith built on the hope that was shared with them of the gospel from Epaphras. So he gives thanks. And then he says, and I pray for you. So the hymn is in the middle of a very long prayer, verse 9 through 23. And so, in fact, verses 9 through 20 is one sentence. Everything we read is the thing all tied together that Paul prays for. So that's the second part of the context you have to remember. So after his thanks, he gives a prayer. And then, by the way, after he finishes prayer, in verse 23 to the end of the chapter, which is what we'll cover next week, he talks about his own mission. So he is going to explain why he's writing to them and how his own mission ties into the message he needs to share. So we'll be looking at that. So that kind of looks at the context both before and after. And then when you got to break down the prayer. So if you've written any of this down, he starts with thanks and then prayer. And his prayer has 4 parts we learned last week. The first 3 parts of the 4 parts of prayer, each of them have a verse. So if you want to write those down again, verse 9, it says, I pray, and it says, I pray that you would be filled with the knowledge of God's will. So number 1 was you would will, God's will. And that's actually all the prayer is related to knowing God's will. And we talked about that last week. It means knowing what God's plans and desires are for them, for the church, for his work in the world, and for eternity. It's not just, what am I going to eat for dinner? And number 2 was In verse 10, prayed for that they would enjoy the strength they have through God and the Holy Spirit to do what God's will is. And then number 11, number 10 was their holiness. So they would live out God's purpose for them. And then 11 was that by God's strength. So God's will, their holiness by God's strength. And then the fourth prayer, or part of the prayer, is that he's praying that they would give thanks. And that's what I want you to take away from this lesson. I'll say it probably every time, is Thanksgiving is not just a minor part of our walk with the Lord. Paul spent a verse on each of the other three things, and he spent like 9 verses on thanks. We need the way we live holy lives and fulfill our part in God's will is to be thankful that God has already done what's necessary and given us the strength to do our part. All right, so that's the larger context of the 4 parts of the prayer. Now, breaking down the 9 verses of the prayer. Everybody with me? Anybody have a question? All right, so the 3 parts of the prayer, just for a quick summary. Let me look at their time. So the 3 parts of the prayer are verse 12 through 14. We didn't really talk about it because it's praying that they would understand. I would use, if you want to write the 3 things down. So on the chalkboard, I would put down the 3 parts of the prayer. Number 1, what they're thankful for. Number 1 is that they're redeemed. So that's verse 12 to 14, redeemed. Number 2 is they're reconciled. So write reconciled for verses 15 to 20. The verse elaborates on what being reconciled is. And then the last part, which we won't spend time on, it's a more basic kind of elaboration on what the gospel is. Number 3 is being transformed. Verses 21 to 23. So that's redeemed, 12 to 14 before the hymn, redeemed. Then the hymn is reconciled. And then after that, the prayer of thanksgiving because they're transformed. And being transformed means, well, so briefly, redeemed, that he's talking about, just like Israel was redeemed out of Egypt from the dark overlordship of Pharaoh. They have been redeemed from darkness, and it doesn't say specifically, but the God of this world is Satan. And so they're paid for, the debt was paid, they're forgiven. And they're not just forgiven and a debt paid. The hymn is talking about that God has reconciled. So now we've got the context. God didn't just pay a debt. He resolved all the differences between God and them, between them and the world, between them and their problems. Every difference we're going to look at was reconciled by the cross. And that's to successfully live their lives and to fight heresy and to live their lives correctly. They need to recognize what Christ did on the cross, and it's so big. And that's why he sings a hymn about it. And it's, if I can pause for a second, it's like John 3:16 elaborated. Jesus says, John the apostle in his gospel, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Here we see Paul in his words elaborating on the thoughts of John 3:16. So if you like to share John 3:16 as a summary of the gospel, you could think of for the rest of your life, if the words that we studied in this series from Colossians come to mind, this hymn to Christ, this is what God's love really did, and looking at it in detail from Paul's perspective. All right, so and then being transformed, which we won't look at closely, but he goes into more detail where he started out in the beginning saying they're redeemed. Look at verse 21 to 23. And you that were sometimes alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet has he now reconciled. So he's summarizing the hymn. In the body of his flesh through death to present you holy, to present. This is a done deal. We are already in heaven in God's sight, who's eternal and outside of time. And he has already presented us holy, set apart, without blemish, unblameable, and unreprovable in his sight. Nobody, God, the devil, or other people can condemn you for anything right now. And we don't have time to go into it. This is supposed to be basic teaching, but you are forgiven and you don't have to do penance or anything. So we just don't have time to elaborate on that passage. All right, so now we finished the context. The other part of the context, not only do you look at where is it written and what's the book about, what's the main theme. And if you haven't guessed it yet, the main theme. So we looked at the context, we looked at the 4 parts of the prayer, and we looked at the 3 parts of the thanksgiving. Now in the center of the thanksgiving is our hymn. And at the center of all this introduction is being reconciled to God. And the whole book's about being reconciled to God. Chapter 2, after his chapter 1's an introduction, laying it out, and then he comes back to it and he talks about it in more detail, that we are reconciled to God. And you're going to see, you have to look at the verses in chapter 2 to interpret the verses in chapter 1, and they will say the same things. And we'll see an example of that. All right, and let me just, for a blessing to you, wait, this is not theoretical. When I say, everyone, the words reconciled, think, like I said, John 3:16, love. We're going to see in this hymn and the words before and after, it pleased God to do this. He was pleased to call us his people. That means he loves us as a father loves his children. So this is the love of God shared with us, that he sent his son to be the center of creation, to change all of creation and to transform it into a new creation because he loves us. And so if you want to be filled with the knowledge of God's will, where he starts, what he means is, you're facing a coronavirus, you're facing death as John did with his sister-in-law this week, and Ed did with his mom. My son this week, Travis, who has mental health issues, had a real bad bout of hallucinations, had to come to our house for 2 days, and we went to the urgent care. We were going to go to the emergency room. He's seeing spiders kind of crawling into his body and stuff, and he was terrified, and he just was afraid. So in the middle of all these things, God loves me, and he has reconciled all things to himself. That it keeps me excited about the Lord and thankful, and able to keep serving and studying, helping others, and nothing can stop me. Paul says, if you study, read this over and over each week, all 13 weeks, it will change your life. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom. That's from Colossians. And it just comes to mind. And he says, strengthen in verse 11, with all might according to his glorious power. And we said 2 weeks ago, or last week, unto all patience, or 2 weeks ago, and long suffering with joyfulness. This joy I'm talking about, the patience is towards circumstances that are impossible, and the long suffering is patience towards people who are impossible, and doing it with joy. That's the blessing that, again, we all should take away from this lesson. Okay, now we got time. We have about 5 minutes apiece to look at the 3 passages that we have. First of all, look in verse 15, who is the image of the invisible God. And I'm going to unmute you. So when you read Christ being the image of the invisible God, what do you think image means? And you knew we were going to be studying this week. I'd like to hear from 1 or 2 of you.
Well, image would be his attributes, right?
Okay. God has attributes, and the thing that we would image would be the attribute. But what does the word image mean?
Likeness.
Somebody?
Likeness.
Who said that?
Mark.
Okay, so likeness. So is Jesus the likeness of God? That's what Mormons and others would say. Why is it has other meanings? That's where we have to look at the words. Anybody else want to say another possible meaning for image?
Reflection of God.
That was Tom, a reflection of God. Okay, I'm going to mute you. That was to get y'all to think. So I did mute everybody, but I'm hearing something funny. Mute all. Why didn't it? Yes, somebody's slurping. There, you're muted. Okay. Image. There's a. I have muted everybody, and yet somebody slurping. Sorry. It's still making that sound. Okay, maybe anybody else here slurping? Or is that just something on my computer? I don't know what's happening. I've got everybody muted. This is fun using technology. Anyway, ignore the slurping in the background, and whoever's slurping, if you could kind of mute yourself or something. Okay. Wow, from the glorious to the mundane, slurping. All right. Image, in the first time it occurs is in Genesis 1. We're made in the image of God. And the word in Greek is a similar one. It's icon. So it's an image. And we think of the word image when we first see the word, referring to like a statue or an idol. So man is made in the image of God. He is God's idol or image or icon, representative, like a king sends some image of the king, of the Queen Victoria and her statue on the earth. Here is a representative, a likeness, and it's not a physical likeness. See, that's the interesting thing. He doesn't have a body, so we're an image, meaning a representative of God. So there's multiple meanings to it. But image also refers to expression of what the messenger is. So the messenger himself can have or express himself. So turn to Hebrews chapter 1, and we'll see some parallels. Turn to Hebrews chapter 1. And this is just one of several references to how image can be used this way. In verses 1 to 3, which is really the other classic passage, the sun came out and I'm bright. This is the other classic passage on the nature of Christ and for heresies. God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spoken in time past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, by whom he also made the worlds, who, being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person. So Christ has expressed who God is. It's not that he's different from God, less than God, or just a thing. He is God expressed. And it doesn't mean just that he had to have a body so we could see and talk to him. It means throughout eternal in the Trinity, God was expressing himself through the person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ. And he did take on a body, and he did express it for us to actually see and touch, but he always expressed God. All right, so we got 10 minutes. So the express image of God, it's important to know that it means more than just representing or being like God. He is God. So you can see that why that matters. Number 2 is, and he is the firstborn of every creature. All right, your turn. We'll see if we hear the slurping. What does it mean for Christ to be the firstborn of every creature? Sounds like he was the first creature born. Comments?
First in rank.
First in rank. All right. So firstborn. Okay, who said that again? That was Mike. Mike, you said rank. If I said you were the firstborn, what would you normally think?
The oldest child.
The oldest child, so not, it could be in rank, but in biological time and in time. Oh, it's funny. Now I hear that sound.
It's you. It's your computer.
It's my computer.
It's your computer.
Okay, maybe it's me having a phone next to it.
It's not.
Huh. Okay, well, that's another problem to work through. So I will mute you because for some reason. Huh. When I mute y'all, my slurping sometimes stops. Okay, firstborn, interesting. This is how words work. When you're talking to someone or thinking about who Christ is, you have to stop them and say words have many meanings, and they're sometimes related, which makes it confusing. The word firstborn naturally arises the first to be born. Then the word gains the meaning because they're first, they usually have priority. Then the word can gain the meaning it's any son who has the inheritance, the priority that the parent has declared. He's a firstborn, and it doesn't mean he physically first in time. And then the word takes on a broader application and means, sorry, it's distracting. Who knows what will happen next week? The firstborn means first in priority. He is the place of honor and the place that all things are below and looked to. And that, how do we know that? Which meaning does it have here? Well, you have to look up the words in context.
Mike, you're getting some kind of feedback or something.
It's still doing.
It's really,
Y'all can hear that noise too?
yeah.
Well, I'm not going to unmute y'all. And
It's okay now.
I have, Phyllis isn't here, so she's not distracting me. It's just my computer sitting here. Nothing else is on. Nobody's slurping. Let's see, do I mute myself? Speak. Oh, I know. Sorry for the distraction. I don't lose anyone. Or let's see if I put this on. This is recorded for posterity too. This is such a great, classy, Hollywood level presentation. Now, if it's still making that funny noise, it's still making that funny noise. Don't know. Sorry, this is not, well, I could have turned off the recording and started again. Do y'all still hear it, Ed? Well, that's too distracting to teach. So let me wrap up this. You can hear me. I don't know what, this is the fun of these computers. I apologize. So raise your hand. Are y'all to mute all? Y'all? So, all right, can y'all hear all the noise still? I can. Mute all. I didn't mute you. Unmute all. There we go.
Yeah, it's still there.
Okay,
It's
well,
still there.
that's a technology problem. I guess that means we're going to have to close this. You'll have to listen for 2 minutes just so. So I told you my main ideas about, and we didn't get to the one of, we didn't. So the fact that Jesus is the firstborn means in priority, and you just need to look at other verses.
It's gone now.
It's gone now.
Yep. Whatever you did, it's gone.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe it has something to do, this is just a glitch on the computer. It's not me. Whenever you click on a mute all, unmute all today, this week, it decided to start making slurping noises. That was the secret code that changes what slurping noises do. I mean, what does. Okay. All right. So
Hi, Mike. It's Terry. Can you hear me?
I can, Terry.
Can the other class members hear me?
They can hear you too.
How can I, let's see, is there a way to, hi,
Scroll
Kim, hi,
the
Tim.
pictures over. Scroll the pictures over.
Okay, no,
At the bottom left, are you
Hi,
trying to see
John.
too?
I can see who's talking. Okay, wait a minute. Share. Okay, I think I see it.
Okay.
Okay.
Terry, I'm going to.
Participants.
Terry, I'm going to do this with you sometime this afternoon or this week if you have time, and we can work it out. Okay, I'll give you a call. Does that work?
Wonderful. It's so great to see everybody.
It's good to see you too, Terry.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I don't want to hit mute all or we might hear slurping. Oh, no, okay. All right. So there are 8 occurrences of firstborn in the New Testament. All of them, none of them are literal except in Luke 2 when it says, when it's in the Jesus account. Every other reference to Jesus being the firstborn is to first in priority. So if anybody ever tries to tell you, and the word creature, if you look it up, even in English, the word creature doesn't mean beast or thing. It means something created. In English, the word creature means something created. And so he is the firstborn of things created. Firstborn means he has a priority because he was before everything that was created. And so to end the lesson, we got 2 minutes. So Jesus is the image, meaning he expressed God because he is God, to where you could hear, see, and know him. Not that he's different from God. And he is the firstborn, meaning not that he's physically born or one of creation. That's the opposite of what Paul is teaching in the rest of the hymn. He has preeminence. He's before all things. He is not part of creation. He's the opposite. He's separate from creation. Unlike most other religions, our God is not part of his creation. Okay? So firstborn just means priority over creation. And then our last point was reconciling all things. And guess what? We'll talk about that next week because we got a little bit of distractions on the slurping. So anyway, any last questions from anyone? Are y'all muted? No, you're not. Any last questions? And then we'll pray. Sorry for the technology. We would have other distractions in class. Technology just gives a different kind of mix of distractions. It's great to see everybody. Great to see you, Terry. And
it's so good to be on here.
That's good. And y'all keep praying for each other. Saturday nights, you can call me anytime. If you even want to see my face or somebody else's face, Zoom is real easy to use, so get used to it. And if you need somebody to come and visit, I've started coming and visit people periodically now. We did one last week, and I'd be glad to come visit you too on your porch, social distancing if you're comfortable with it.
Yeah.
So let's
Hey,
close
one
in prayer.
thing.
Go ahead, Terry.
I haven't got to say hello to the Calhoun yet and say how sorry I am about you missing your mother there. Sorry to hear about that.
Thank you, Terry.
All right, Terry, we cut off automatically by the thing, and it's going to happen any second now. So when I cut off, it's not because I don't like anybody. All right, let's pray. Lord, thank you for your love. Thank you for reconciling us to you, but not just us, our friends, the whole church, and the whole creation we're going to learn about next week will become a new heaven and earth, just so we could enjoy fellowship with the whole creation together in